Hello, traveler. You are early today. Let me tell you about a woman who stepped into the hot summer light and began to dance. Not for joy, not for coin, not for performance. She danced because something no one could see, took hold of her, and she simply could not stop. The cobblestones of Strasbourg shimmer in the July sun of 1518. It's the kind of heat that makes thoughts sticky and bread go sour before lunch. The Rhine nearby does little to ease it, and the townsfolk go about their chores half-cooked, their clothes clinging to damp backs, their tempers one sneeze from snapping. Chickens pant in the shade, bakers curse their ovens. And in the middle of this medieval stew, Frau Trophia steps into a narrow lane and begins to sway. At first, no one minds. Maybe she's just being odd. People did that back then and, frankly, still do. She dances through the morning, then the afternoon, shoes clapping against the stone with a rhythm that grows more erratic by the hour. When night falls and she still hasn't stopped, eyebrows start to rise. When she dances into the second day without eating, drinking, or sleeping, the neighbors stop with their gossip and start whispering prayers. Now, before you get too cozy, if this little tale brings a smile, feel free to tap a like, as the young folks say. And if you'd fancy hearing more down the line, well, you know where to find me by subscribing. It's always nice knowing who's out there listening in. So go on, pop a comment, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is by your clock. Write them, mind the splinters. And let's begin our little journey. Frau Trophia's feet are swollen by day 3, and a small crowd trails her like she's a one-woman carnival. She's not smiling. She's not even aware of the attention. Her eyes stare ahead, distant, locked somewhere behind her own skull. Her limbs move like puppets jerked by strings, strange, tireless, mechanical. A baker swears she saw the woman weep mid-step. A boy says he heard her scream through clenched teeth without stopping. The town priest starts looking nervous. Strasbourg, after all, is no stranger to odd happenings. Just a century earlier, a pogrom had swept the Jewish community into flames, and in recent memory, plague, famine, political messes. This city may be medieval, but it is far from magical. No fairy tale, no once upon a time, just taxes, trade, and terrible shoes. And now this woman, thrashing in her linen dress, as if her bones are fighting her skin. By the 5th day, a few others have joined her. A man from the tanner's quarter, 2 maids, a boy who was fetching water and simply dropped the jug and spun in place. They writhe through alleyways, twitch in front of the bakery, collapse in fits only to rise again moments later and resume. Local physicians with their impressive robes and equally questionable theories are summoned. One of them, a bearded fellow with a hat so wide it could double as a breakfast table, declares this to be hot blood. Naturally, the sun is to blame, he claims. Too much heat has caused the humors to bubble over. The cure? More movement. Let the blood burn itself out, like trying to fix a house fire by throwing more kindling on it. So the town does what any reasonable 16th century town might. They clear a marketplace and let the dancers dance. Some even bring in musicians. A flute here, a drum there, a lute plinking nervously. Imagine being the guy hired to play music for people who might collapse and die mid-jig. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Records from Strasbourg's municipal archives confirm that this event did indeed occur, and that city authorities actively intervened. But here's your quirky tidbit. The dancers didn't always move to the same beat. Some spun wildly. Others jerked like marionettes. A few marched in place for hours, stiff as scarecrows. One woman reportedly tap-danced herself into a seizure. People today still argue whether this was a physiological epidemic or a psychological one. Was it food poisoning, mass hysteria, possession? Some suspect ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces effects similar to LSD. Imagine tripping out without the benefit of music festivals, bottled water, or emotional support llamas. By the time the week turns, dozens are caught up in the trance. And here's where the mood in Strasbourg shifts. What was first seen as peculiar, then pitiful, now feels dangerous. No one knows how many might join next. The dancers themselves can't answer. They barely speak. They mutter nonsense or scream at nothing or hum forgotten songs. Their eyes don't see the crowd. Their legs betray them. Children are kept indoors. Horses shy away when led near the market. A merchant, trying to sell pears, finds himself shouted down because the dancers start twitching more violently near his cart. He later claims pears are the devil's fruit, which feels unfair to both Satan and pears. And still, Frau Trophia, weeks in now, dances. She is moved, quite literally, to the edge of town, her body so thin and bruised, it's a wonder it holds her up. But still she twirls, feet blistered, dress tattered, hair tangled with sweat. No one remembers what started it anymore. The questions have shifted from, why is she dancing, to, what is this? The old women cross themselves, the young men fetch wine, and the town, in this sweltering summer of 1518, stands still, except for those who cannot. By the second week, the cobbled streets of Strasbourg have begun to echo, not just with the shuffle and slap of bare feet, but with the deep, mounting unease of a city watching itself unravel in real time. Frau Trophia is no longer the only dancer. She's been joined by what some describe as a congregation of chaos. 20, 30, 50 people now move in irregular rhythms as if some phantom orchestra composed entirely of out-of-tune accordions has possessed their limbs. And yet, they do not laugh. They do not sing. They do not smile. This is no festival, no tavern jollity, no wine-soaked wedding reel. This is dancing without joy, movement without music. At night, they twitch in the moonlight. By day, they glisten with sweat, their limbs seizing and spinning, their bodies pale from dehydration and the relentless July sun. The city council, a normally bickering group of bearded men prone to arguing over chimney regulations and cheese prices, suddenly finds itself in agreement. This is bad. A civic crisis is unfolding, and unfortunately, the budget doesn't cover sorcerous outbreaks of uncontrollable jigs. They issue decrees, they consult scholars, they lock their doors slightly faster than usual. Even the merchants are nervous. Normally quick to find profit in disaster, some have tried selling amulets or miracle clogs, only to have their stalls knocked over by a man flailing into them mid-pirouette. You might think this would be the perfect moment for the church to shine. And, to be fair, the priests do step in. But what they bring is less healing grace and more apocalyptic dread. Fire and brimstone sermons begin to echo through the squares. Some declare this a curse from St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics. A curious resume, admittedly. Others claim the devil himself is loose in Strasbourg, though it's unclear whether he prefers the minuet or the Charleston. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. At the time, people genuinely believed in saints as active intercessors who could both heal and punish, and St. Vitus had long been associated with strange fits and frenzied dancing, known since antiquity as choria sancti viti. In some regions, people suffering from these afflictions would be led in processions to statues of St. Vitus, sometimes in actual choreographed dances, in the hope of finding relief, which feels a bit like curing hiccups by yelling louder. But this plague is not cured, it spreads. One widow, Agnes by name, dances herself straight into the Ill River, soaked and shivering, before being fished out by a fisherman who now refuses to eat trout. A farmer collapses mid-spin in the grain market, prompting others to avoid barley for fear it carries the twist. More dancers join by the day, forming a sad, relentless conga line of misery. A man falls, teeth broken, eyes wide and still. When the convulsions pass, he tries to rise again and dance. Medical men, most of whom carry about as much actual science as a fortune cookie, propose a solution, a wooden platform erected in the town square where the afflicted can dance freely, safely, and one assumes with fewer opportunities to crash into fruit stands. To assist, musicians are hired. A flute player, a drummer, even a lute trio is commissioned, much to their visible distress. After all, they were trained in courtly ballads, not in background music for what's starting to resemble a plague-themed rave. The logic, if one dares call it that, is simple. Let the dancing play itself out, like lancing a boil or waiting out a toddler's tantrum. The physicians believe that if the body needs to purge itself of excess heat and blood, best to let it do so in a contained environment. The cure for dancing? More dancing. It's the sort of logic that makes you wonder whether 16th century medical degrees came in cereal boxes. Here's where the jokes start to wear thin for the townspeople. By the third week, over 100 people are afflicted. Food vendors won't come near the plaza. The town's water bearers begin refusing to refill buckets within the circle of jerking. Someone draws a chalk line around the square and claims stepping inside brings doom. Cats vanish, unrelated but suspicious. Rumors swirl of entire families joining in, of a baby twitching in a cradle, of a blind man dancing in the night and somehow stepping perfectly in rhythm. People today still wonder whether some sort of mass psychological event is even possible on this scale. Can panic truly be contagious? Is belief alone enough to move the body? In the 20th century, psychologists would study mass psychogenic illness, linking everything from laughter epidemics to fainting spells in schools. But back in 1518, all Strasbourg has is a platform, a few exhausted pipers, and a city square that's beginning to stink of blood and blistered feet. Some of the dancers begin to chant, not songs, but fragments of sentences. Half prayers, mumbled guilt, nonsense. One man repeats the name, Maria, over and over. A woman recites the Lord's Prayer backwards. A boy simply screams. The sound is constant now, shuffling, whimpering, drum beats, sobs. Of course, not everyone is frightened. One enterprising monk declares that the dancing is a penance divinely ordered. He begins to bless the dancers as they pass. He also sells indulgences on the side for those watching at home. A true multitasker. Meanwhile, the city's cloth merchants complain that demand for new shoes has risen, but so has the stench from old ones. Some even propose burning the dancers' shoes publicly to cleanse the air. This sparks a brief theological debate over whether sandals can carry sin, which ends with someone flinging a boot at a priest. At night, the music stops, but the dancers don't. The moonlight casts their shadows long across the buildings. From an upper window, one might see a dozen figures spinning silently, limbs jerking like broken marionettes, eyes wild with exhaustion. It is eerie and, somehow, deeply sad. The morning air in Strasbourg, if one dares step outside, now carries more than the usual smells of damp straw, yeast, and overworked horses. It is threaded with the sharp tang of fear and sweat. By the start of August, the dancing has infected not only the bodies of those afflicted, but the minds of everyone else. Even those not twitching in the square are twitching in their souls. The city is divided. Not evenly, mind you. No medieval town council has ever been accused of fair representation. On one side are the pragmatists, led by the guilds and merchants who want the whole mess swept under a rug, preferably one large enough to cover 100 convulsing townsfolk. On the other side are the spiritualists, convinced that this is either divine punishment or a demonic infestation, possibly both, with a discount on Sundays. But everyone agrees on one thing: the situation is slipping out of control. The city council meets in a thick-walled chamber that smells like boiled cabbage and worry. It is there, beneath a tapestry of St. George looking smug with a dragon head in his hand, that the first real plans are drawn up, not to stop the dancing, but to prevent its spread, which is rather like deciding to fix a sinking ship by painting over the holes. They begin by banning public gatherings, especially musical ones. This includes weddings, festivals, and the weekly goat and fiddle contest, much to the despair of a man named Klaus who'd spent weeks training his goat. Market musicians are fined. Drum makers are told to find a new trade. One poor flutist is chased down the street by a group of cobblers wielding their hammers like holy relics. And yet, despite this musical prohibition, the dancers continue. Now more than 200 strong, they sway and stagger through the town square, some with bloodied feet wrapped in rags, others barefoot and oblivious. They twitch even in sleep. Some no longer speak. One man, eyes rolled back, repeats the phrase, "Ich bin leicht," I am light, as if floating above his own pain. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Municipal records from Strasbourg show that the city did, in fact, pass bans on music and dancing during the outbreak, including the hiring of street musicians. At least one councillor suggested that music itself had become infectious, a kind of sound-borne illness, centuries before headphones would make that observation painfully true. Meanwhile, the local clergy is split. Some insist that the town's sins have summoned this plague, that dancing is a punishment for moral decay. Others argue it is not sin but sorrow, that the people are possessed not by devils but despair. Because, let's be honest, 1518 isn't exactly a banner year. The Rhine floods that spring had wiped out crops. Taxes had risen to fund a pointless war no one in Strasbourg could name. A famine hovered on the horizon, and the Holy Roman Empire was lurching toward another crisis, like a drunk trying to ride a horse backwards. People today still argue whether the outbreak was a form of mass trauma response. Was the dancing a subconscious release valve for a population under unbearable pressure? Was this grief in motion, sorrow turned kinetic? Whatever the cause, the town is unraveling. Businesses close early. Streets are quieter, except for the clamor of the afflicted. Mothers warn children not to linger near windows. The city becomes a ghost of itself, haunted not by spirits but by flesh and bone figures whirling in the market square. And then come the accusations. It starts small. A woman is seen whispering prayers near the dancers and is accused of witchcraft. A foreign merchant unfamiliar to most is blamed for bringing the affliction. His goods are seized. He is not heard from again. Whispers of poison, curses, and old forest spirits begin to fill the gaps that logic cannot. One man claims he saw a crow land on Frau Trophäa's shoulder on the first day. It cawed 3 times, he says dramatically, which means the devil was definitely involved. No word on what 3 quacks from a duck might mean, though Strasbourg would later pass laws against duck-based omens. As tensions grow, the council makes a show of doing something, anything. They dispatch envoys to nearby towns, asking if others are experiencing similar outbreaks. A messenger returns from Saverne and claims no dancers, but adds that 3 pigs there walked in a circle for half a day. The council chooses not to follow up. They also attempt to cordon off the dancers. Rope barriers are erected, and guards are posted, not to stop the afflicted, but to keep others from joining. But the lines blur. A baker's apprentice sneaks under the rope and starts spinning next to his sweetheart. A priest's niece twitches once and is immediately escorted out of town. Every fidget becomes suspect. A sneeze during a sermon is met with narrowed eyes. Even the city's healers, such as they are, begin to waver. One suggests applying leeches. Another proposes painting sacred symbols on the dancer's skin. A third recommends cold baths, but quickly retracts after 3 dancers try to spin underwater and nearly drown. Meanwhile, the dancers keep moving. Rain does not stop them. Thunder frightens them, but only briefly. One woman is struck by lightning, truly, and is knocked flat, only to rise minutes later and resume her swaying as if electrocuted elegance were just another dance form. Onlookers begin to speak of them as something other, not sick, not cursed, but changed, like moths who've forgotten what it means to land. The sound of the dancers is constant now. Flesh on stone, bone on wood, shoes tearing apart, and the gasping moans of bodies pushed far past their design. Yet still they move, as if led by an invisible hand with no mercy and a terrible sense of rhythm. No one knows how it will end. By now, Strasbourg is a city under siege, not from a rival army or a foreign king, but from within. The enemy is rhythm, and its victims wear no armor, just torn skirts and broken sandals. As the dancers continue to twist through the late summer heat, their presence begins to reshape life around them. People plan their routes to avoid the square. Vendors refuse to set up stalls. The city's rhythm has been replaced with another, one that stumbles and jerks and bleeds. Desperation is thick in the air, and with desperation comes invention. The physicians bless their medieval hearts, return with new theories. Perhaps this isn't hot blood, they say. Perhaps it is demonic humors or overexcitement of the solar essence. One doctor even suggests the moon might be involved, which is suspiciously convenient timing since it's full that week. So what do? The most natural thing imaginable, they build another stage. Yes, another wooden platform, this one larger, surrounded by garlands and with room for musicians and soothing audience presence. The idea is to treat the dancers not as sufferers, but as performers. That maybe, just maybe, if they are given a proper venue, they'll eventually stop. One can only assume the logic here was drawn from the same place that gave us bloodletting and pigeon-based tumor therapy. They even hire a troupe of traveling musicians against the city's own ban on music, no less. The flute players arrive with nervous eyes and heavier than usual contracts. The drummers, once enthusiastic, now beat with a rhythm closer to resignation than rhythm. One lutenist reportedly asked for hazard pay. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The city authorities did employ musicians and build dance platforms to try and contain the outbreak, believing that encouraging the dancing might lead to its eventual exhaustion. And here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicler claimed that the dancers responded worse when the tempo slowed. A few collapsed instantly when the music shifted to a dirge. One man, reportedly, only danced to the sound of bells and threw a cobblestone at anyone playing a flute. People today still wonder whether the council's approach helped or hurt. Was music a balm or a match to dry tinder? Did the platform calm the chaos or formalize it, giving the suffering legitimacy it should never have had? The platform becomes an eerie theater. Townsfolk gather around its edges, half in fear, half in fascination. Children peek from behind barrels. A butcher's wife murmurs prayers. A man sells roasted chestnuts, keeping one wary eye on the stage at all times. It's entertainment, in the same way watching lightning strike the same house twice is entertainment, horrifying, impossible to look away from, and something you quietly hope never happens to you. The dancers stagger onto the stage, some willingly, some gently guided by city guards who no longer bother hiding their unease. The music starts, light at first, almost apologetic, and then the dancers move, not in time, not with grace, but with force, like broken puppets trying to remember how to be human. Some flail until they collapse. Others rise again moments later, as if sleep itself were an unwanted guest. The audience gasps, flinches. A boy watching from a rooftop gets sick. A councilman faints when a dancer locks eyes with him and screams the name of his dead mother. This may have been coincidence, but it doesn't feel like it. The church, not wanting to be upstaged by a wooden rectangle, announces its own intervention. Sermons are ramped up. Priests begin performing Mass in shifts. A shrine to St. Vitus is hastily erected near the square, complete with candles, relics, and a suspiciously new-looking bone fragment, allegedly from the saint's foot. Its resemblance to a pig-knuckle is quietly ignored. Penitents begin to gather. Some wear hair shirts. Others whip themselves with reeds as they circle the square, hoping the dancers will see and find deliverance. They don't. They twitch on, eyes glassy, lips cracked from dehydration, feet raw from friction. One priest begins shouting Latin verses over the music. A flutist stops mid-note, confused. A dancer shrieks. Another begins to bark like a dog. The crowd panics. Someone throws a stool. The scene dissolves into chaos, and the stage collapses under the weight of too many convulsions. This would be funny if it weren't so grim. Like watching a circus tent burn down while the clowns keep juggling. Still, the idea that this is a moral crisis gains traction. A public fast is ordered. Bakers are told to make unleavened bread. Butchers are banned from selling meat on holy days. One man proposes bathing the dancers in holy water. He is later chased from the square after attempting to sneak up on a particularly fast-moving woman with a ladle. The only real relief comes at night. Some dancers collapse and do not rise, not from healing, but from exhaustion. Their limbs give out, their minds retreat. They are carried away, often unconscious, their faces slack, their bodies as limp as rags. Others begin to disappear. Not die, vanish. A woman reportedly walked into the woods, still dancing, and was never seen again. A boy spins into the cathedral and hides behind the altar, where he's found days later, curled into himself, whispering apologies to someone no one else can see. The city is fraying. The stage remains, but fewer and fewer musicians return. The council debates burning it down entirely. The priest with the bone knuckle relic insists it must be used for good. Meanwhile, the dancers don't care. They move, whether on stage, in streets, or in alleyways, whether to music or silence, whether watched or alone. People start to fear that this won't end, that maybe this is what Strasbourg is now, a city of dancers, doomed to twist forever in heat and hunger. The stage is splintered now, sagging like the patience of Strasbourg's citizens. It groans beneath the weight of dancers who no longer even pretend to be people. They are motion-made flesh, each one a trembling prayer that someone, somewhere, might know what's happening. But no one does. The physicians, ever determined to contribute something other than confusion, decide it's time for more direct methods. If encouraging dancing hasn't worked, then let's be honest, it absolutely hasn't. Then maybe discouraging it the old-fashioned way might. And by old-fashioned, we of course mean bleeding, blistering, fasting, and yes, leech application. Because, when in doubt, medieval logic says, Remove fluids until the problem leaves in shame. Patients are dragged, sometimes mid-samba, to makeshift treatment tents on the edge of town. There, healers mutter about bile imbalances and lunar influences as they affix cupping jars, slice open veins, and stick leeches onto calves still twitching to rhythms no one else can hear. One man is bled twice in a day and reportedly thanked the doctor between fainting spells. There are few greater symptoms of the Middle Ages than thanking someone while actively hemorrhaging. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Bloodletting and purging were widely used treatments in 1518, and many of Strasbourg's afflicted were subjected to them, sometimes repeatedly. And your quirky tidbit? Some of the leeches used in Strasbourg were rumored to have been special, taken from ponds near monasteries, as if a bit of holy silt clinging to their bellies could purify sin through suction. People today still argue whether these so-called treatments helped anyone. Likely not. The bleeding weakened already exhausted bodies. The fasting, ordered by both physicians and priests, removed the last energy reserves some dancers had. At least one case ended with a patient too weak to stand, but still twitching on the floor like a broken metronome. And yet, for every person being treated, another joins the ranks. The numbers swell to over 300. The platform is abandoned. The square is too crowded. Now the dancing spreads into alleys, through taverns, into homes. One woman reportedly danced in her sleep, rising from her straw bed and pirouetting straight into a stone wall. The city tries containment. Guards block certain roads. Dancers are relocated again to a large barn on the outskirts, recently emptied of livestock. Straw lines the floor. Windows are barred. It's more stable than the stage, at least, and the acoustics are surprisingly decent. Unfortunately, it now smells like a mixture of sweat, hay, and despair. Less music hall, more mosh pit in a stable. The church responds by doubling down, literally. Twice the sermons, twice the relics, twice the number of concerned monks waving incense at anything that moves. A full procession marches through the city bearing banners of saints and chanting prayers for deliverance. It's solemn, beautiful even, until a dancer crashes through the line and sends the crucifix bearer toppling into a barrel of pickled cabbage. This is not just chaos, it's theater, tragedy, and absurdity rolled into one. The kind of event that makes future historians rub their temples and mutter, "What were they thinking?" The answer? That it was punishment. Still. That it was demons. Still. That it was the body rebelling against sin, the devil, or both. The clergy proposed that each afflicted soul carry a wax effigy of St. Vitus. Pilgrimages to his shrine are organized. Dancers are herded onto wagons, trembling and half-conscious, and carted off into the hills to the chapel at Saverne. Some collapse along the road. Others arrive and begin to sway inside the sanctuary, as if even holy ground can't stop the rhythm now. There's a moment here, a quiet one, oddly enough, when the city seems to hold its breath. The square is empty. The music has stopped. The barn is full, but no one new is dancing. Perhaps it's ending? And then comes the child. A girl no more than 8 begins to hum in the market. She spins once, twice. Her mother grabs her wrist, but the girl shakes loose. She dances. The crowd freezes. One man weeps. Another walks away, muttering about moving to Basel. The guards don't stop her. You can feel the hearts in Strasbourg sink through the floorboards. So now the treatments shift again. No more music, no more prayer. Now comes the brute method, isolation. Dancers are shackled, tied to posts. In one case, wrapped in cold, wet blankets and locked in a wine cellar until the spasms stop. They didn't. But he did start singing old tavern songs about sausages, which some viewed as progress. Physicians finally stop offering advice. The priests preach quieter. Even the city council, once so bustling, meets less frequently. A mood of exhaustion settles over the city, like they've all been dancing too, just differently. The town tries to live around it. Shoemakers begin reinforcing soles. Bread sellers offer quiet hour discounts. One enterprising man creates a sort of padded helmet for dancers. He sells two. The third explodes in feathers. And always the motion continues. One can hear it faintly if you wake up at night. Not drums, not footsteps, just the sound of something shifting like wind or breath or grief with feet. People today still wonder how no one really stopped this. But how do you stop something that's both absurd and terrifying? Something that makes no sense, yet makes itself at home in your very streets? Something that dances like it's never going to stop, because maybe, just maybe, it can't. High in the hills above Strasbourg, past the vineyards that haven't quite recovered from last year's floods and the sheep that always look slightly judgmental, sits a small chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus. It's quiet here, serene, even mildly scenic, if one can ignore the occasional wagon load of convulsing citizens being hauled up the incline like particularly fidgety cargo. This is the city's new hope, the shrine, a final gambit. A sacred place where, perhaps, the plague of dancing might be driven out by holy relics, whispered prayers, or at least a change of altitude. And so the dancers arrive. Some are escorted by guards, some by hopeful relatives. A few come stumbling on their own, legs worn to sinew and bone, eyes unfocused but feet still shuffling. They are led into the chapel one by one. Some collapse the moment they cross the threshold. Others tremble beside the altar, clutching wax figures of Saint Vitus like life jackets in a sea of confusion. A handful begin spinning in the pews, knocking over candles and nearly igniting a hymn book. Welcome to the most awkward pilgrimage in Europe. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of Strasbourg's afflicted were indeed taken to a shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Saverne in hopes of divine intervention. And the quirky tidbit? Some reports mention that dancers were given red shoes anointed with holy oil because clearly if someone's dancing themselves to death, what they really need is better footwear. People today still argue whether this religious retreat helped anyone. Some accounts claim a few dancers did recover after their visit, though it's hard to tell if that was divine mercy or simply the benefit of rest, distance, and not being treated like a civic circus act. The square is quieter, not out of peace, but because people are afraid to speak too loudly in case the sound sets something off. The barn still houses the worst cases, now more hushed and spectral than frenzied. A few of the afflicted simply sit and rock slowly. Others mutter phrases no one understands, like, "the air has edges," or "he's behind the stone." The town tries to go back to normal, or at least whatever normal means after you've watched neighbors jitterbug their way into unconsciousness for a month. Market stalls reopen cautiously. Weddings resume with no dancing, thank you very much. A new law is quietly passed banning unlicensed rhythmic movement. Someone tries to invent a dance tax. No one laughs. Even Frau Trophäa, the woman who began it all, has disappeared from the record. Some say she was taken to the chapel and never returned. Others believe she died mid-step, her body finally refusing to obey whatever madness had puppeteered it. One merchant swears he saw her walking through the forest weeks later, perfectly still, her feet bare but clean, and her eyes so calm it made him forget how to speak for the rest of the afternoon. By mid-August, the outbreak is fading, not with a bang, nor even a faint drum beat, but with the heavy, awkward silence that follows when something truly inexplicable finishes without apology. The dancers stop, or fall, or vanish. No great revelation, no miracle, just an end, but not closure. Because here's the thing about the human mind, it hates blanks, and the Strasbourg Dancing Plague leaves nothing but blanks. It doesn't fit, not into religion or medicine or politics or folklore. It is an itch on the edge of the historical record, an asterisk with no footnote. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so deeply unsettling. Theories bloom in its wake. Was it a curse? A protest? A fungal hallucination brought on by spoiled rye? Was it grief made physical, a mass psychosis born from hunger and horror and heat? Or was it, as one priest swore, a warning of worse things to come? People today still wonder why no similar outbreak has reached quite the same scale. There were others, of course, lesser dances, smaller spasms, but nothing like this, nothing that turned a prosperous city into a half ballet, half funeral. The tale of Strasbourg begins to spread, not just as gossip, but as myth. Other towns whisper about the dancing sickness. Artists paint grimly elegant interpretations, most of which, frankly, give the dancers far better posture than they likely had. Plays are written, poems composed, and St. Vitus gains a curious fame, part protector, part perpetrator, depending on whom you ask. And of course, as with all such stories, there are the doubters. It never happened, some say. Exaggerated, others claim, just a misunderstanding. But the records are there. The council notes, the physicians' journals, the merchant ledgers showing drop-offs in business, the faint trail left by hundreds of feet that danced too long, and the town remembers, not loudly, not proudly, but in the way a place remembers something it can't forget. There's an old woman who still places bread by the chapel every July. A superstition, they say, but she doesn't miss a year. There's a festival now in a nearby village where people dance on purpose, in neat rows, with smiles, with water stations and a full brass band. But every once in a while, someone will glance off to the side to where the trees begin, and just for a moment swear they saw a figure twirling there alone, to music only they could hear. Because while Strasbourg sleeps again, the question never does. The square in Strasbourg, once a theater of fevered motion, is now strangely still. Not peaceful exactly, more like a room that was screaming moments ago and now holds its breath, waiting for the echo to die. The dancers are gone, or so it seems, but the streets remember. The scratches on the stone remain, the grooves carved by hundreds of shuffling feet. The town shoemaker, after months of repairing torn soles, briefly considers switching to hats. In the weeks that follow, Strasbourg tries to forget. It has taxes to collect, crops to salvage. A wine shipment from Basel delayed by a mysterious goat incident. The church quietly shelves the most dramatic sermons. The physicians stop talking about humors and go back to diagnosing people with things like lung dampness and spirit congestion. No one really wants to talk about what just happened, because frankly, no one understands it. And there's nothing more embarrassing than being terrified by something you can't even explain. But the world beyond Strasbourg? They're not so quick to move on. Word of the dancing spreads like spilled ink. Letters are written. Priests whisper it from pulpits. Merchants bring the tale to other towns where it is received with a blend of disbelief and delighted horror. And then, the strangest thing of all, people start admitting it's happened to them too. See, Strasbourg wasn't first. It wasn't even rare. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Europe experienced multiple episodes of so-called dancing plagues or choromanias from the 14th to 17th centuries, though none as well documented or dramatic as Strasbourg's. And your fringe fact? In 1237, a group of children in Erfurt reportedly danced uncontrollably through the streets until they dropped from exhaustion, a tale that some believe later morphed into the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. People today still argue whether these outbreaks were related. Did they share a cause? Were they cultural echoes of some deeper, more ancient unease? Or was each one its own unique burst of inexplicable energy, like the universe sneezing in the form of dance? In Aachen in 1374, hundreds danced through the streets, their bodies writhing and limbs jerking as if controlled by puppet strings made of panic. In Metz, Cologne, and even as far as the Netherlands, similar episodes were recorded, groups of people struck by the sudden, irresistible urge to dance until collapse. Some sang, some screamed, others shouted the names of saints or barked like animals. One report claimed a man danced with such fervor that he kicked through a stained glass window. These weren't joyful dances, they weren't festivals or rituals. They were uninvited, undesired, and deeply unnerving. Medieval society, faced with these outbreaks, responded in the only way it knew: prayer, penance, and more platforms. In one town, they built a bridge specifically for dancers to cross while being blessed. In another, they brought out relics from 5 different saints at once, hoping one of them would land the miracle. One town in Belgium reportedly tried chanting Gregorian hymns at dancers while simultaneously ringing bells and flinging rose petals. Aesthetic, if nothing else. You begin to see the pattern. Dance, panic, preach, repeat. There's even speculation that these outbreaks were more common than the records suggest. After all, if your town had just barely survived a dancing plague, would you want to admit it? It's hard to get trade partners to take you seriously when the last report out of your city involved a blacksmith tangoing into a bakery window. Historians looking back often focus on the psychology. Theories include mass psychogenic illness, social contagion, and something poetically called shared affective trance states, which basically means people are weird and sometimes get weird together. But others point to the physical. Ergotism, caused by eating rye infected with a hallucinogenic fungus, has long been suspected. It could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and an overwhelming urge to move, like dancing, or flailing, or both. And guess what crop was abundant in the Rhine Valley during the summer of 1508? Then again, ergot doesn't explain why only some people danced, or why it happened repeatedly over centuries. Or why, when the dancers were moved to shrines and chapels, some of them stopped without medical treatment, just quiet, prayer, and distance. It's possible we'll never know, which, frankly, makes it better. Because part of what makes the Strasbourg Dancing Plague so haunting is not just that it happened, but that it refuses to settle into any neat category. It's not a disease, not a riot, not a miracle. It is a glitch in the record, a skipped heartbeat in the timeline. A group of people who, for reasons we may never understand, moved their bodies against their will in a world that wasn't prepared to stop them. And maybe that's the part we find hardest to face. Not that they danced, but that they danced, and we still don't know why. The deeper you look into the Strasbourg Dancing Plague, the murkier it becomes. It's like peering into a well and expecting to find your reflection, only to see a pair of feet mid-jig staring back instead. Every theory, no matter how tidy on paper, starts to wobble the closer you try to fit it over the facts. It's like trying to put a hat on a wind gust. By now, the story has become less about the town and more about the question, what causes people to move when they do not want to? Take mass hysteria, or what we now politely call mass psychogenic illness. It sounds very clinical until you realize it's essentially group panic with jazz hands. Under this theory, the dancers of Strasbourg weren't poisoned or possessed, but mentally overwhelmed. The stress, starvation, sickness, and grief all condensed into a shared nervous breakdown with choreography. After all, it was a hard year. Famine loomed. The Holy Roman Empire was teetering on dysfunction, which, to be fair, was its natural resting state. The church was cracking under reformist rumblings. The Rhine had flooded, the crops were poor, and the townsfolk were already thin from bad bread and worse news. When life becomes unbearable, the body sometimes does what the brain won't act out. And if one person breaks the seal by collapsing into rhythmic spasms in public, who's to say others wouldn't follow? Not because they choose to, but because deep down, something in them gives way. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Modern scholars often cite mass psychogenic illness as the most likely explanation for the Strasbourg outbreak, especially given the period's social and environmental stressors. Now, your quirky tidbit: during a laughing epidemic in 1962, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, entire schools were shut down after students began laughing uncontrollably for days. No one ever figured out why. But at least they weren't dancing. People today still argue whether the Strasbourg outbreak was really hysteria at all. The term itself, originally used to pathologize women and the occasional overly dramatic man, is murky, and many point out that calling it a mental illness, simply because we can't explain it, is a historical cop-out. Like blaming elves when the chimney leaks, so others return to the ergot theory, dented grain idea. Ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye, can cause spasms, hallucinations, and seizures. It was also, funnily enough, a key ingredient in the synthesis of LSD. So yes, your sandwich can be too exciting. But there's a hitch. Ergot also causes vomiting, gangrene, and death. The dancers didn't report those. And if the grain were contaminated, why weren't more non-dancers sick? The bakers, the clergy, the musicians who were presumably eating carbs like there's no tomorrow. What about a religious explanation? That's where St. Vitus waltzes back in. To the medieval mind, he wasn't just the patron saint of dancers, he caused dancing. Praying to him could protect you from involuntary movement, seizures, and madness, but ignoring him or angering him, that might result in what people called the Vitus dance, a condition we now associate with chorea, a real neurological disorder involving jerky, involuntary movement. And the shrine at Saverne? A known site of pilgrimage for centuries. So when Strasbourg's afflicted were hauled up there, maybe it was more than just tradition. Maybe it was a kind of psychosomatic ceasefire, a place the mind could believe healing might occur, and so perhaps it did. Still not satisfied? Neither were the 20th century scientists who pointed out another possible cause, encephalitis lethargica, a mysterious brain inflammation that swept through Europe centuries later. It caused tremors, behavioral changes, and yes, uncontrolled movement. But that came long after 1508, and there's no evidence it existed then. Which brings us to a final theory, all of the above, that the Strasbourg Dancing Plague was not one thing, but many. A perfect storm of hunger, heat, grief, fear, bad theology, worse medicine, tainted bread, contagious trauma, and the ever-present medieval tendency to blame either God or goats. People don't like messy answers. They want a culprit, a switch to flip. But Strasbourg offers no such comfort. It offers only the image of feet bleeding on stone, of a woman spinning in silence, of a child humming and stepping forward while her mother looks on in horror. And perhaps that is the real weight of the tale, not its inexplicability, but its recognizability. Because who among us hasn't felt the urge to move when we should sit still, to collapse when we're meant to endure, to shout when the world is quiet? The Strasbourg dancers did what many of us feel deep down. They let go. Was it madness? Possibly. Was it grief in motion? Probably. Was it human? Absolutely. So now we have our story, strange, sad, and still waltzing at the edge of understanding. But before we let it slip fully into the realm of myth and metaphor, it's worth remembering Strasbourg's plague was not a one-time curiosity tucked between pages of medieval trivia. It was part of a pattern, a rhythm, a recurring beat across centuries, heard in towns and cities across Europe, echoing in the bodies of those who, for a moment, could no longer say no to motion. The records don't always agree. Some say 15 dancers here, 100 there. Some name the saints invoked. Others mention the taverns closed or the sermons shouted. But the stories hum the same note. People danced when they didn't want to, and no one could stop them. In Basel, they banned music for a year. In the Netherlands, entire families were reported dancing through fields at night, their bodies silhouetted against moonlight like haunted marionettes. In Zurich, a preacher declared dancing a sin that enters the legs when the heart is unguarded, which sounds oddly poetic for a man who also believed cheese to be morally suspicious. And then, slowly, these plagues fade, not overnight, not with a neat historical ending, but like a fever that breaks in the middle of the night, leaving you wet, breathless, and unsure if it was real. Why did they stop? No one knows. Maybe it was the slow spread of Enlightenment thought, reason nudging out fear, medicine beginning to question the usefulness of leeches and planetary alignments. Maybe it was better food, or fewer famines, or more consistent policing of flute players. Or maybe the rhythm simply moved on. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Choreomania as a phenomenon essentially vanished by the 17th century. The last major recorded dancing plague occurred in Madagascar in the 19th century, though it was viewed more as a ritual possession than mass illness. And your quirky tidbit? In 1840s France, there was briefly a moral panic over waltzing. It was considered so sensual, so dangerously hypnotic, that some churches banned it, fearing it might stir the same ungovernable passions as the old dancing plagues. Apparently, if you hold someone and spin, civilization itself begins to sway. People today still wonder what replaced these outbreaks. Did the same psychological pressures find new outlets? Fans, fanatics, social media dance challenges? Or have we simply found different masks for the same unrest? Because humans haven't changed that much. We still break down, just with newer vocabulary and better shoes. What the Strasbourg Dancing Plague leaves us with is less of an answer and more of an invitation to look at history not as a solved puzzle, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, maybe we see ourselves, not dancing perhaps, but anxious, spinning, twitching toward something we can't quite name. The town itself, of course, survives. Strasbourg, modern and cosmopolitan now, wears its past with the quiet indifference of cities that have seen everything. The square still stands. Tourists walk it daily. There's a plaque somewhere, small, tasteful, very factual. No mention of bloodied feet. No mention of the musicians who kept playing until they wept. No mention of the priest who fainted when the dancers wouldn't stop. And yet, in certain corners, you'll find a whisper of the past. A bar named after St. Vitus, a bakery that sells dancer's loaf, spiced with rye, of course. A local legend that once a year a stranger appears in the square, barefoot and humming. Because memory doesn't always live in books, sometimes it lives in posture, in superstition, in the way a town refuses to install speakers in its public spaces just in case. And it lives in art. Painters, musicians, and writers return to the story of Strasbourg again and again. They draw the twisting limbs. They compose soundtracks of discordant flutes and muffled drums. They tell the tale to children, softened with phrases like strange spell or mystery illness, because existential collapse under systemic stress doesn't rhyme with anything. But beneath the poetry, the real weight remains. A city danced. People died, and no one could explain why. Even now, researchers revisit it. They squint at 500-year-old council records. They modeled the outbreak on graphs and maps. One group even tried to simulate it in a lab, using flashing lights and repetitive music on college students. It did not go well. One undergrad got a nosebleed. Another just started quoting Shakespeare. Still, the story endures, not because it has answers, but because it asks. It asks, what happens when a community breaks down? What happens when fear is louder than facts? What happens when movement becomes the only language left? And if you listen closely, quietly, you might still hear it, a beat, a pulse. The faintest tap of shoes on stone, the rhythm of something ancient, confused, and deeply human. Dancing. The summer is long gone now, and with it the sweat and sorrow that once soaked the stones. Autumn has settled across the city like a quilt, quiet, crisp, edged with the smell of wood smoke and cider. Leaves scuttle across the square where, just weeks ago, bodies spun themselves into collapse. The dancers are no longer here, but that does not mean they are forgotten. The town moves on as towns do. But something lingers, not in the official record that has been neatly sealed away in Latin, in Kirk's handwriting that slopes like nervous hesitation. No, it lingers in the silences. In the way the musicians hesitate before playing in the square. In the way old women glance down at their feet when the bells toll noon. In the fact that for years afterward, no one danced in public. The Strasbourg Dancing Plague of 1508 never repeats itself in quite the same way. The big outbreaks dwindle, the rumors thin. But the feeling, that mysterious, uncomfortable awareness that the human mind can be swept away by something wordless, lawless, and strangely communal, never fully leaves. And in the centuries that follow, even as medicine sharpens and religion adapts and politics becomes slightly less prone to blaming goats, the memory of the dancers remains as a kind of parable. The kind that doesn't come with a moral, just a mood. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Modern research into mass behavior, somatic disorders, and social contagion often cites Strasbourg's Dancing Plague as a case study in collective stress response, a kind of psychological wildfire fueled by shared trauma. And the quirky tidbit? Some folklorists believe that echoes of the dancing plagues appear even in modern urban legends, like stories of cursed songs, haunted music boxes, or dances that once begun cannot be stopped. People today still wonder whether we've really moved past such things. Sure, we have better shoes now and fewer leeches and somewhat improved explanations, but even today, aren't there moments, concerts, protests, panic-buying frenzies where the crowd feels like one single creature? One body with too many feet? Maybe the dancing never truly stopped. It just found new forms. So, what happened in Strasbourg? Was it grief turned kinetic? Fungal hallucination? Sin, fear, starvation, suggestion? Was it all of those? None. A little of everything, marinated in madness and cooked under a sweltering July sun. We may never know. But we do know this: something gripped that city, something real. And in the face of it, no one physician, priest, piper, or poet had the answer. Only questions, only rhythms, only motion. And now, perhaps, it is time to let that motion rest. So, here we are, at the edge of a city that once danced itself to the brink. The lights have dimmed, the drums have faded, and the last dancer has bowed into the hush of history. But the story stays with us, doesn't it? Perhaps not as footsteps, but as feeling. Imagine the square now, quiet, cool, bathed in moonlight. No crowds, no music, just a breeze tugging at the corners of a forgotten stage. The stones, smoothed by centuries of feet, lie still. The buildings lean in as if listening, remembering. They do not speak, but they do not forget. And neither do we. Strasbourg reminds us that history isn't always clean, that sometimes the past leaves behind questions shaped like people, shaped like fear, shaped like rhythm, that sometimes things happen that cannot be folded neatly into charts or footnotes or theories. That's all right. Some stories are meant to be held, not solved, to be whispered, not dissected, like this one. So now, traveler, lay back a little. You've made it through a strange little journey. Thank you for staying with me. Close your eyes, let your feet be still, let your breath slow. There is no music now, only the gentle hush of knowing something few others do. Let the dancers rest, let the city sleep, and so should you.